infrastructure has become, well, an emotional, sometimes even sensitive issue, and rightly so. It's become a priority in countries in Southeast Asia. If you take a look at Indonesia, President Joko Widodo had a $300 billion spending plan, and when he got re-elected, that was up to $400 billion. In the Philippines, President Duterte has a $160 billion plan, and here in Thailand, just the EEC alone, that project costs about $50 billion. That gives a reflection of how much is at stake and how much is needed in terms of infrastructure building here in Southeast Asia. The problem, as we all know, is the funding gap. And over the last 5 years, we have seen increasingly how China has come to the forefront to provide that funding. Estimates vary, but some suggest that China has already spent $200 billion to date. Of course, China's involvement has also prompted some kind of criticism about transparency, governance. Some say it is a debt trap, but however you look at it, some say as well that China has moved the needle when it comes to infrastructure development, not just in ASEAN, across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America even, so pretty much across the globe. Let's get insights, perspective of where we stand today. President Jin, let's start with you. When you take a look at China's involvement in infrastructure development and infrastructure funding, how big a role is it playing now?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very much happy to be here. As the bank's name indicates, our mission is to promote infrastructure development. Thereby, we can pave the path for the sustained economic and social development in Asia and beyond. And the origin, actually, of this bank is based on the development experience of China and so many other Asian countries, particularly, for instance, Thailand. China started its open number reform in 1980 with virtually nothing in terms of modern infrastructure. And then over the last 10 or 15 years, China invested massively in infrastructure with quite a portion of money borrowed from outside. So the end result, Chinese economy took off, or started to take off in the mid-1990s. China was never, ever in a debt problems. So it might be interesting to take a look at experience of China, Thailand, and some other Asian countries to see how you should invest in infrastructure and make it work. So by general statistics, Asia needs $1 trillion every year for the next 10 years to improve, to upgrade in an infrastructure. So this is a tall order, and it's not easy. So our job is to promote infrastructure development by very high standards, governance, transparency, and environmental protection and protection of the people in the project areas. And this is our job, and this is our duty. Thank you.
Kun Kanit, has China moved the needle in terms of funding for infrastructure? We had U.S. Vice President Mike Pence coming out to say, you know what, the U.S. provides a better deal than dealing with China.
In case of Thailand, we think that money is one of the matter, but we support the BRI and we support AIIB because the infrastructure. I support Dr. Jin who said the infrastructure, that's work is a key. In case of ASEAN, we have been working for the lack of infrastructure for decades now. The decade means we have the GMS, it's not complete yet, not money flow in. The $10 billion a year for improved infrastructure has been set for some times, but that number never come. This times around when China opened the gate and doing the work, so they have something that we should be able to support in terms of directions, that making infrastructure in ASEAN, as you say, CLMV, is very necessity and must do in the urgent way. So that we give a full support to BRI. But anyway, the financings of the project depend on the project and project, depend by country and by country. But having money is a good thing, so I could say at this point. Yeah.
Yes. You know, if we look at the BRI and in the context of the past several decades of Chinese economic growth, I think what we have to really look at for us in ASEAN is how the Chinese economic miracle, in such a short span of time, just maybe 3-4 decades, was able to lift hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty. And primarily doing that through massive investments in infrastructure. And for countries like the Philippines, where our albatross till today is the lack of modern infrastructure, this is clearly a model that we want to look at. And I think the BRI is just an opportunity, not just for China, but for the rest of the world, including ASEAN, to learn from that miracle, from that experience. Because bottom line, infrastructure is not just infrastructure for itself. It's infrastructure for people, to make people's lives better, to lift people out of poverty. And for countries like the Philippines, where we still have roughly about 20% and above of our people living in poverty, this is critical at this stage. So as our growth, to use the oft-repeated phrase, inclusive growth, our growth truly becomes inclusive. And the way to do that, we believe, is through massive investments in infrastructure.
One of the issues that come up big when it comes to BRI is sustainability. Let's start with debt sustainability, because when it comes to sustainability, there are various factors to it. Debt sustainability has become an issue, and people say the BRI has, in a way, put emerging economies in particular in debt, but not really the case for the Philippines, because the loan from the BRI accounts for just 1% of total debt.
Yes, actually, I would like to argue that the Philippines has spent too little for infrastructure. We have, I think on average in the last 10 years, we have spent just a little over 2.5% of our GDP on infrastructure. Whereas, as we saw earlier, China, India, some countries in ASEAN have spent upwards of 7 to 8% of their GDP on infrastructure. This is something that we must catch up on in the coming years, because that is the only way for us to make sure that our growth isn't only sustainable, it is also more inclusive. So right now, our debt to GDP ratio stands at around 41%, which is very low. And it will probably even be reduced further to about 39% in 3-4 years. So we do need to spend more, but we have to spend wisely as well. I mean, we've heard all the stories of some countries not spending their money the right way, not spending their borrowed money the right way, not on the right infrastructure. And I think this is critical. At the end of the day, it is the country's responsibility to spend the money the right way and for the right reasons.
Debt sustainability, we've seen what happened in Sri Lanka. How do you address such issues? Nobody's forcing the country to take the money.
You see, perhaps we should look at the debt problem in its true perspective. People tend to confuse the difficulties or debt problems at the macro level vis-a-vis the micro level. At the micro level, it's inevitable. Certain projects financed by the external resources or domestic would go sour for whatever reasons. That's the micro issue. Probably it's the management, whether the timing of the investment was not good or the design implementation of the project was not good. So it's a micro issue. Macro issue, if you look at many countries, including, for instance, Sri Lanka, you need to look at what is the debt situation, okay? How the macroeconomic situation stands in terms of the external borrowing and the investment and domestic investment. So when you look at that, probably the external financing is never ever really the culprit. It's always the macro management of the government in dealing with that. So if you look at the general situation, most of these countries, and if you find some of the countries are in trouble, partly because the mismanagement, and partly because the mismanagement is complicated by external shocks. Okay. My view is infrastructure development is key for the long-term sustainable development. And if a country at a relatively high debt level stops investing or improving in infrastructure, that would do a lot of damage to their long-term development. On the contrary, if the country can use the external resources or domestic resources judiciously, put the resources in the right way, and then you will find the economic base would be expanding, the debt level would come down. And in most of the cases, a very good investment would help them to generate export incomes moving forward. Let me tell you the interesting debate in China early in the 1980s. In 1980, I went to the World Bank, started to work in the World Bank, and China started to borrow from the World Bank. And we put money in building roads. So there was a debate in China whether it was well advised to borrow money, foreign money, to put it on the dirt. In 1980, Mexico was hit by the debt crisis.
Yeah.
So you see, this is a lesson. Mexico was already in trouble. Are you going to repeat the same problems in China? But those who prefer to borrow from outside to improve infrastructure prevailed. We never got into trouble because we borrowed to invest. We never borrowed to sustain unsustainable high level of consumption.
Is there a risk nowadays, Kun Kanut, that perhaps we're constantly pushing for billion-dollar projects which may not be useful to the common man? I mean, just to get the example of Myanmar, a 10-lane highway which is left empty most of the time. Does that make sense?
The key is the both persons are right. The first one is that we need to push for more infrastructure investment, especially in ASEAN. Husband, we don't drive from here to Rangoon because the road from Thai border to Rangoon is so bad, so we cannot drive there. So the lacking out is there. The second thing we're talking about is how the project is bankable. You need to have the good feasibility study of the project that can be bankable in the sense that under private banker or from the international development bank like this in order to be able to finance in a good way. So that's something we have to work and find that project and make it happen. Now when we do the things in EEC, you're talking about infrastructures alone around $20 billion. All of them will be financing by the PPP program. The country need not to borrow money to do that work, but we ask the private sector, private banker, and AIIB, JBIC to financing through the private sector themselves, the one who winning the bidding. Meaning that the country will be able to have the lower debt level, debt to GDP. In case of Thailand, our debt to GDP is just 42%. Actually, it's too low, actually. You should have something more to finance by bond, by everything. But anyway, we have been able today, right now, to do the good bankable project and select what the good way to finance that kind of project. In terms of PPP in EE, some of the project, government pays some money. Some of the project, private sector pays some money, and diversify the risk among us. So that's be able to something come up with it. I think the big project will be like that. If in that case, your debt burden, your debt issue is outdated, you need not to talk about the government debt anymore. But if the debt to the government is a small sum that the government has to borrow, but most of the thing is backed by the private sector. I can assure you that the private sector in Asia has a lot of money. The banking sector in Asia has a lot of money. AIIB has a lot of money to back them up as well.
Let me add one point. Money is not the issue.
Yeah.
Money could be a big issue. Money is not an issue, money could be a big issue. See, when something goes wrong, you put the blame on the investment in infrastructure. That's the problem. So when we promote infrastructure investment, we highlight the point that infrastructure investment must be done in the right way. And there should be well-coordinated and integrated approach to infrastructure investment. You build an expressway in no man's land. Of course, you have to wait for centuries to get back your investment return. That's another way. So we highlight the point, coordination. You build a port. Are you thinking about improving the railway connection, highway, and whether the port's handling capacity will be to such an extent and you leave room for further expansion down the road? The same is true of airport. Or you build a power plant without thinking about transmission lines. And of course, the power plant is completed, but should not be operated because there's no transmission line. Or the transmission line would be waiting for the power plant. Now, all this is because of the bad planning, bad arrangement, not because of the infrastructure investment itself.
Not because of the money, I said.
Yeah. to that point, Haslinda, just to give a specific example, our state-owned enterprise, we are in charge of converting and developing former American bases in the Philippines. There were two major ones, Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Base. This was turned over to us in the early 90s, in 1991. However, since that time, and that's almost 30 years from today, there was very, very little investment of the government in infrastructure to develop those areas. And what has happened since then? What has happened since then is Metro Manila, our capital, which is the only metropolis serving the main island of Luzon of roughly now close to 60 million people, is now bursting at the seams. We have a population density of about 20,000 per square kilometer. We're in the top 3, top 5 in the world. And this development that we are doing in Clark, as President Jin said, is a long time coming. It should have been done decades ago. However, it needs to be planned properly. There has to be connectivity between the seaport and the airport. There has to be world-class highways leading from the seaport to the airport all the way down to Metro Manila. The airport must be developed. And now that we're trying to build a new metropolis, a new city there, everything has to fall into place. So I agree absolutely. It's not about the money. What the most important thing is the planning and the kind of projects that will be eventually funded, whether from the national government, through the private sector, or through multilateral agencies.
Just to add, in case of EEC, when we build the high-speed train, right, we're not thinking about how to build a high-speed train or why the high-speed train. We're thinking how we create a city along the line of the high-speed train so that infrastructure needs something in terms of development, that you can have the economic return or financial return. So that kind of bankable project I'm talking about, it's just not that you're going to build the highway. It's not the highway itself, how the highway can create the economic value along the way. The high-speed train, how can we connect to the southern China to get trade connections, logistic business come. Those and this kind have to think thoroughly before we can do the bankable project that we think. So as I said, we have the money prepared to help us. That is good. But the way to think of the project, like in Clark, you need to think about the economic value, how the cluster of the economy will be there, right? The same thing applies when we build the Utapao airport. We're thinking that in the next 10 years, so the area will be the metropolis, aerotropolis, I should say. So that kind of thing. So that we just not build the airport, but build the economic around the airport. So that's the key.
I want to pick up on the issue of PPP. I mean, there is some kind of consensus that that's the way to go when it comes to infrastructure funding. When I spoke to Piyush Gupta of DBS, he says, you know what, when it comes to ASEAN, ASEAN grows at night because there's no government involvement. or at least little government involvement. And I spoke to one minister. He suggests that, you know what, I can go without the private sector because they're way too slow. President Jin, I mean, how do you connect the two?
I think sometimes it's a little bit difficult to push for PPP because the government, not lack of government involvement, because the government has its own perspective, has its own priority, and the private sector has their considerations. So if they don't, they are not thinking in terms of the common objective, how do they achieve that? If their thoughts are not running in the same groove, there will be problems. So I think it's still a difficult issue. But the government, in my view, should try to do its best to improve the enabling environment, not getting too much involved in the details of the particular investment. Making sure that the regulatory policies in place will be improved and no interference with the management of the particular project. Very often, the government officials like to go all the way into the details of the running of the operations. That's a big issue. With regard to the private sector, certainly they want to achieve high returns, as high as possible. But in today's world, the private sector investors should also have a high sense of social responsibility. They may not aiming at the maximize the profit. They should sacrifice a little bit over the profit side, but try to do more to help the government achieve the broad objective of economic social development. For instance, the private sector should do more to create jobs for the local people and do more to deal with the mitigation of climate change. And they will do something not simply for the immediate financial returns, but for long-term interests of the society. That would probably make things, improve in the PPP. There are very good experiences in this regard. Not many, perhaps, but it's possible. It's not mission impossible. It's possible, but it's difficult, as I said.
Green projects. How do you ensure? I mean, you've done roads, you've done airports, ports. How do you ensure projects are green? And you're funding the right green project.
Absolutely. For BCDA, when we look at the development of former military bases, we have had the experience of Fort Bonifacio, which is now the premier economic center in the Philippines. However, what we've noticed there is if we completely delegate the development and the responsibility to the private sector, then, as President Jin said, the natural incentives of the private sector kick in, which is really to maximize profits. And in land development, that is really trying to milk every square meter out of the land. And this has resulted in the lack of green spaces and public spaces. This has resulted in very little investments in mass transit, meaning too many roads, not too many investments in mass transport. And because of this, obviously, the climate effects of those investments are being seen today. What we're trying to do now in Clark is we're trying to wrest control of the development and the regulation of the development for the government agency. This is very difficult because this is difficult in the sense that the private sector is always at an advantage to raise funds for development. The government, not that much. So we are at a point where we have to balance ensuring that the developments continue to be green. For example, use of smart grid technology for power and water. If it were up to the private sector, this would be too much of a cost and that will entail lower margins for them. But we as government have to mandate that. in order to ensure that these projects become more sustainable moving into the future. So there needs to be a very delicate balance that the government must do in order to ensure the sustainability and the greenness of these projects.
For the EEC, Kanit.
In EEC, we have the clear policy that we don't do any more of the pollution, no matter what it is. Industry we're talking about high technologies, automation, those it is. So the pollution is nothing to us. And the same thing, we have the concept of circular economy implanted into the project we're going to do. But I want to come back to the President Jin's point, how can we engage the private sector in? In case of Thailand, it's quite strange because the public and private sector work very close. But when we do the real project, you need to do a lot more of market consultation. Ask them what they need, how to adjust the rule regulation that Dr. Jin said on the government side to fit to the need of the private sector. In case of Thailand, the infrastructure project we have in EEC, the 4 project, has been led by the Thai private sector, not the foreigner. They bring their foreign allies, the good company come. In case of the high-speed train, so what we have is the China company do the rail, we have the French company, we have those and this coming, Japan company come by as one consortium. So if you work with them, you talk to them, you understand what do they need, how can we get them into one pieces that we can work with them. Also the project it takes time, but the government has to understand. The private sectors always understand what we're going to do. So now, for example, when we first do the PPP, I would say that Kun Sili is Bank of Thailand here. He spent some of the money try to identify what the impediment of the public-private sector laws and regulations should be changed before we do the work. So that's the kind of combinations of the public and private sector. We have a chance to do, but we have to talk. We have to give a good conditions, a good way of thinking. Say if you want to have the green one, you say you want a green. Why? And how much the price would be like? How can we compensate it to them? That can be done, Haslin.
We know that AIIB does not give loans if the project is not 100% green. How do you debunk opinions out there saying, if you take a look at emerging economy and the stage of development in the country, that maybe you should cut them some slack? Take a look at coal, for instance. It is still the cheapest option.
Well, you see, we don't have any coal projects in our pipeline. We do mostly renewable energy projects, solar panel and certain hydro. And we improve the transmission lines. We build a smarter grid. In our research, we find that many of the Asian countries still have a lot to do to improve their transmission system. In some of the countries, the systemic loss could be as high as 30%. Just imagine, you improve the transmission distribution system, cut the systemic loss all the way down to, say, 5%. You don't have to build power plants. You can meet the vast amount of power need in many of the countries and in many of the areas. So in our view, building infrastructure projects in a clean way is very much important. For instance, we support in India 2 subway projects, Mumbai and Bangalore. The ground transportation is so congested, it's not sustainable. And we would encourage the people to take the mass transit system rather than to drive their individual cars. So subway system is very much important. So what we do is to try to promote a green economy, but you need to look at the green defined in a broader way. You simply cannot say only when you do a renewable project, solar panel, it's green. That's not true, right? But to shifting away from fossil fuel to reduce the dependence on coal, I think is important.
We have 15 seconds, but if I can just go down the line very quickly. I mean, all countries in Southeast Asia want to accelerate their infrastructure development, yet it's still at a very, very slow pace. How, if there is one way a government, either through PPP or its own initiative, if there's one way it can do, what would it be? One way, one policy, what should it be? Vince?
I think it shouldn't be a choice between the private sector and government. Both have to work together to make these critical infrastructure projects happen in the shortest possible time. Governments have the capacity to raise cheap finance through multilateral agencies and through bilateral official development assistance. On the other hand, the private sector has the ability to mobilize faster, to do feasibility studies faster, to do detailed engineering faster. So I think there's a very possible balance between the private sector participation and national government taking the lead in looking at a macro plan for the entire economy. And this is what President Duterte is trying to do through his unprecedented Build, Build, Build program.
So PPP, Kanit?
PPP should help to be very helpful for
Is
the
there
country
another?
like Thailand. But what I try to add is that you need some good advisor. In case of Thailand, we can manage ourselves. We had advisor, we have the knowledge to do PPP, those and this. But the country like Myanmar or like Laos, they don't have it. So you need somebody to help them to make the project bankable in a sense, that kind of thing. In the old day, we have ADB, those and this come. But this time around, it seems we lag behind of continuing technical assistance to get the project done.
President Jin?
I think the challenge is still for the governments how to improve the state governance. For the corporate sector, how to improve corporate governance. And if they can work together by a very high level of governance, I think we can solve lots of problems.
On that optimistic note, gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.